Hello, everyone. Today is July 12, 2022. Thank you all for joining the Price Formation Enhancement meeting to discuss the issue paper. My name is Brenda Corona here with the Stakeholder Affairs Group at the California ISO. I'll be helping facilitate today's meeting along with Chris from the event producer. Here we have James Verdesh and Gabe Murtaugh from the California ISO, along with our management from Brad Cooper, who's here today to help facilitate this call for us. Today, I would like to present a few meeting reminders to go over for this call. This call is being recorded and will be posted next week on the ISO initial website. Please make sure when you do have a question, please keep the dialogue and appropriate and respectful for those who are in the call. We will go over, the stakeholders will have time to have read the proposal as well, refrain from repeating any other questions that were asked during the meeting. But if you do experience any technical issues during the call, please send me through the chat or my event producer as well so we can help mitigate that issue. And then for those who are on the audio only, please use the pound 2 on your device to be able to come in to ask a question. So also to proceed with the call, if you do have a question, please state your name and affiliation before asking your comment, and we will be able to know who you're coming, what group you're coming from. And for today's agenda, we will have these 4 topics to go over with James and Gabe, and then we plan to end around 4 for the next steps. So we will plan to stop at every topic to ask questions, so please utilize the raise hand icon so that way we could call on you. And then when you're done asking your question, feel free to put the hand icon down so we can make sure your question was asked. But during this call, just want to get a quick reminder on the stakeholder process, how it works. So right now, we're starting at the very, very beginning. So prior to the straw proposal, the issue paper right now we just posted last week is what we're going to discuss today. And then the next steps will be the straw proposal and then hopefully the draft final proposal and then so forth. So with that, I will go ahead and invite James to go ahead and lead us way through this meeting.
Thank you, Brenda. So good afternoon, everybody. So the intention of today's call is to discuss the issue paper that was posted last Tuesday, I believe, relating to Price Formation Enhancements Initiative. So there are, as Brenda mentioned, there are 4 major topics that we'll discuss today. These 4 major topics were all part of the issue paper. My plan today for questions is going to be to pause after each topic is finished. So each topic might take 3 to 5 slides to finish. And then once that's finished, we'll open it up for questions and comments. Next slide, please. So I just want to sort of level set on where we've started. We sort of kicked off this initiative on June 9th, 2022 with a stakeholder-led workshop. So at this workshop, the CISO had solicited stakeholders that were interested in presenting to prepare materials and present their organization's perspective on the topics that we have scoped for this initiative. So the entities listed on the slide were the ones that had made presentations. All of their presentations are available on the initiative webpage. And I just want to, before we proceed, thank these entities again for the time and effort that they put into their presentations and preparing materials. And we really appreciate that and really appreciate sort of kicking off the discussion of these topics at this workshop. And I just also want to note before we move on that PowerX and Calpine both have provided associated reports. PowerX report in conjunction with Public Power Council and Energy GPS on fast-start pricing. That report is available on our website as well as on PowerX's website. If you have not seen it yet, feel free to look there to find it. And then Calpine posted a report in conjunction with GDS Associates on scarcity pricing. So also encourage those that have the time and interest to go check those reports out, and they're really good detailed discussions about fast start pricing and scarcity pricing that could help provide some additional detail and thought as we move into eventually into a straw proposal for this initiative. Next slide, please. So I also wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that at the initial June 9th workshop, we had heard questions or comments from stakeholders who wondered about specific topics, whether or not they might be considered within this initiative. And I had listed these 5 that were brought up during that meeting, and I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge these topics, because part of this initiative, we are prompting stakeholders to, if there are issues that are perceived that don't appear to be within scope, you know, like captured within these slides or captured within the issue paper that stakeholders think we should prioritize, we want to hear about those. And these were a couple examples that were brought up sort of in that category. And we wanted to make sure to acknowledge that these items we did not feel like were in scope, so that when stakeholders are, you know, preparing for their comments, they don't, you know, repeat certain items that we can acknowledge early on are not necessarily within scope. Now, that being said, there are a couple of items here, like in regards to like pump storage, modeling enhancements, and RDRR specifically, where we acknowledge that the eventual scope and price formation scope of this initiative may affect the way that these resource types set price and are considered within the market optimization. So I don't want to say that those, you know, considerations won't be made. I just wanted to point out that maybe with the exception of energy storage, which does have a special home within this initiative at this time, we're not really considering any resource-specific changes as it relates to price enhancements or price formation enhancements. So I just wanted to bring that up. And then within the issue paper, you know, we describe, you know, for example, decremental market power mitigation is an example where, you know, this is an issue that we are aware of. It's part of our, you know, policy catalog. It's just not, it already has a future home in a different initiative. And so we're just acknowledging that we're aware of these issues. It's just not, this is just not the initiative we will consider. Let's go one more slide. Okay, so I'll pause there. I see a couple hands up. So let's take those hands to maybe questions or clarifications on the first few slides.
Moving on to our first hand raised. Alan, your line is unmuted.
Hi, Alan Meck, San Diego Gas and Electric. Can I get clarification by decremental market power mitigation? Are you talking about system market power mitigation?
No, so that's a good clarification. So by decremental market power mitigation, what we're talking about is mostly market power mitigation for decremental bids for storage or for other, or it could be for wind and solar resources. So it's basically, you know, today's market power mitigation, we consider mitigating bids, you know, for injections onto the grid, and decremental market power would consider whether there's market power moving in a downward direction on a local level.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, moving on to our next hand raised. Dan, your line is unmuted.
Hey, thanks. Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. So, James, appreciate you acknowledging the comment made in the last meeting about the commitment costs and bringing in consideration of market-based commitment costs. There's not really any other place to follow up on this, and the reason that I brought it up is that it's something that we continue to hear stakeholders kind of wondering if or when that's going to get brought back onto the table. You know, it was part of the 2018 CCW initiative. It was something that the MSC spent a considerable amount of their opinion to the board on the CCW proposal, talking about how natural gas price volatility in the EIM areas and with the expansion of markets, more reliance on use limited resources, those sorts of things, just how important having flexibility in the bidding of commitment costs is to having a efficient market. It got de-scoped in the middle part of 2019, but at that point it seemed like it was something that the ISO was looking at bringing back onto the table, I think as early as 18 months after implementing CCW, the initial phase of that. So, if it's not going to be something that's part of this initiative, it would at least just be nice to kind of hear what the ISO is thinking about it, when it might be back on the table in the future. I didn't see it in the roadmap anymore. Didn't see it in the stakeholder catalog anymore. So just if you have some time to share thoughts on it now, that'd be great. If it's more of an MPPF type of a discussion, just kind of noting that for the future would be nice too.
Dan, this is Brad Cooper. Right before we file the CCW tariff amendment, and it seems like ancient history now. It's only a few years ago. I'm forgetting the exact details, but it boiled down to, under what you're calling the market-based bidding of commitment costs. I'd rather call it unrestricted bidding of commitment costs with dynamic market power mitigation of commitment costs. Under that structure, entities would have been limited, and even during the transition period, I think it was. Anyway, under that structure, you would not be limited in your commitment cost bids, but if you were subject to market power mitigation, you'd be then your commitment costs would be mitigated down to the commitment cost dead. And entities, as I remember, on both sides were unhappy with that. And as an alternative, we modified our proposal and we kept the existing paradigm where you are allowed to bid up to 125% of your commitment costs, or calculated commitment costs, or more correctly, I should say your default commitment cost bid. Well, no, 125% of your costs plus another 10%, which makes up your default commitment cost bids. And everyone was happy with that and thought that was preferable than the potential to be mitigated down to the 110% of the bid. So we did alter our proposal. What we ultimately filed at FERC was somewhat different than those initial discussions in CCW. And then there's also the consideration that since that time, in the day-ahead market, we're now considering the extended day-ahead market. And in the real-time market, we're considering changing the final run of what's known as RTPD5 to allow the resource sufficiency evaluation to be moved up to T-40 to T-30. Now, we haven't put that in yet, but the plan is to put that in after flexible ramping projects enhancements. So both of those things are going to be significant loads on performance, which also the dynamic commitment cost mitigation is a significant load of performance. So we could look at, I guess we could look at that after we get those things in, kind of assess the performance. But my gut feeling is if we opened that up again, policy-wise, we would well land where we are today.
Thanks, Brad. I appreciate that walk back through some of the history of it. It definitely has been an initiative and an effort that took a lot of time to keep your hands on over the years. You know, I just think that after it was implemented, you know, well, before and after it was implemented, there was a variety of views on kind of where the policy actually landed. And then, you know, in the FERC process, it ended up being wound back a little bit from even where the proposal started. And just, I guess, a note for the future would be, it would be nice, and maybe in the MPPF, to have some discussion of the performance of the functionality since it's been in place for a couple of years now, including what entities' experience has been with any of the after-the-fact cost recovery filings, which have also seemed to go kind of, to be kind of difficult. And to circle back to some of the comments that the MSC just made in their opinion, you know, if we're going to talk about price formation issues and trying to improve the efficiency of markets, it's a key component of it. It's something that EDM entities or potential EDM entities have brought up in their comments, and I just wanted to make sure it didn't get passed over too quickly. So I'll leave it there and let y'all keep moving.
Thanks, Dan. Okay, so let's switch gears now to scarcity pricing. And like I said, I'm gonna go through the few slides here on scarcity pricing, and then hands can trickle in, or you can ask questions in the chat, and then we'll go through all of them once these slides are up. Okay. Okay, so first, scarcity pricing, what is it? So scarcity, well, when we're talking about scarcity pricing, what we're talking about is the mechanism with which the market sets price when there is insufficient supply to cover a variety of energy products traded in the market. So it could be energy or ancillary services, ramping products, or any other reserves requirements that are needed to be met. So in the California ISO market, we use administrative values together with supply bids to set prices under scarcity. And why we are thinking about this, why we are thinking about scarcity pricing is that in both summer 2020 and 2021 heat events, and in 2020 there were outages, you know, it prompted the ISO to look back into its scarcity pricing market design after, you know, a few entities had pointed out some anomalies with pricing during tight system conditions. And it's really important to establish that accurate pricing during tight system conditions is very important in maintaining system reliability, because it provides all sorts of incentives that align well with good operation of the grid. It incents resource offers, you know, both on the ties and internal. It penalizes non-performance to the extent that a resource is supposed to be providing you know, capacity or energy in the real time and they're not available to do so. Scarcity pricing helps to essentially keep those resources on the hook for buying back those schedules at prices that are penal to them. And it aligns the price signals that ultimately come out of the real-time market with a consumer's willingness to avoid load curtailment. So to the extent that, you know, consumers, which we know they do, place high value on not having their lights shut off, when we're in scarce conditions, prices should be allowed to reflect that value. So let's move to the next slide. So here's an example of it's one of the price anomalies that I was talking about during the load shedding event. And this figure comes from Dr. Scott Harvey's presentation at a, I believe, December 2020 Market Surveillance Committee meeting. And what you want to follow on this slide are the blue line and the orange line, especially as the behavior of these lines during the gray shaded area, which is the load shedding period on August 14th. So you can see that the orange line are the RTD 5-minute prices, and the blue line are the 15-minute FMM prices. And you can see that in response, leading up to scarcity events, that prices in both of these markets are rising to the bid cap around $1,000. And then midway through this gray shaded area, midway through the load shedding event, you can see RTD prices tank down somewhere, probably even under $100 in this case, midway through the load shedding event. And then shortly after, you see FMN prices tank to similar levels before the load shedding event is over. And so we're asking ourselves, why do things like this happen? We don't think it's appropriate for prices to move in this way during load shedding events. And we don't think that having prices around $100 in the middle of a load shedding event properly reflects system conditions. So this is just an example. There may be others from the last two summer experiences. And this is also just energy prices as well. It might be interesting to look at AS prices and how they're moving during tight system conditions. But hopefully this provides just a good visual on sort of what we're talking about here. Next slide, please. So in the next couple of slides, I'm going to just briefly describe sort of what our existing scarcity pricing measures are for different products to try to level set, sort of what, the basics of what is done today. So first, let's talk about energy. So when there's insufficient supply of energy offers or ramping capability, the ISO market sets energy prices at the penalty price for violating the power balance constraint, which can either be $1,000 or $2,000, depending on the conditions. So I want to note, I want to return back to the insufficient supply of energy offers or ramping capability, because a lot of times the power balance constraint penalty is violated, or the power balance constraint is violated due to a lack of ramping capability. So it's not necessarily always just a lack of energy offers in some, but it can also just be meeting intertemporal constraints between intervals. You're not able to provide sufficient ramping capability to move your system from one interval to the next. So we have implemented some recent changes related to energy scarcity pricing in the last several years. First, we had FERC Order 831 measures that were implemented that under certain conditions increase the bid cap, and by bid cap we mean the dollar value that resources can submit to the ISO in their bids to be considered in the market. But also the power balance constraint penalty price can also go up to $2,000 under certain conditions. And then under the market enhancements for summer 2021 initiative, we had implemented a change where when the ISO operators are arming load, and that term means that they are dispatching resources that were being held for reserves as energy and using, pending load shed as able to meet their contingency reserve requirements. When that energy is released from those contingency reserves, we will release it back into the market at the applicable bid cap and not at the resources submitted energy bid. So that was a sort of a subtle way to address one of the issues that we saw on the slide with the FMM and RTD prices, where during load shedding events, when operators are arming load, the prices tank. This change could help us avoid that. So we'd be looking to build upon some of these more recent changes. Let's go to the next slide. Now for ancillary services, this will take up a few slides, but I wanted to just level set on what the AS, it's important to know how ancillary services are procured and their requirements to understand how ancillary service scarcity pricing works. So this slide sort of goes over the basics of that. First, the ISO market meets 100% of its ancillary service needs in the day-ahead market. And then only procures incremental needs if they are needed, if system conditions warrant them, either in HASP or in FMM, and does not procure any AS, either incremental or otherwise, in RTD, so in the 5-minute market. No AS is procured. Ancillary services are procured in zones. So we have different defined regions and sub-regions within those regions, which we procure ancillary service requirements, so that if you are short in a specific zone, you could trigger scarcity pricing for those AS products, specifically within the zones that are short. But it also is, we also put this on the slide to be clear that we do not procure deliverable or transmission deliverable ancillary services in the day-ahead market. And that will come back up in a later slide. We also procure ancillary services in a cascading fashion. So what that means is that we have an order of highest quality ancillary service to lowest quality, where reg up is the highest quality, then spinning reserve, then non-spinning reserve. And if it's economic to do so, the market can procure additional reg up or additional spin to meet the non-spin requirement, and can also procure additional reg up to meet the spin requirement. And so in that way, if there's a shortage of, a lack of non-spinning reserve offers, the market can use regulation up or spinning reserve to meet that requirement. And that's relevant as we go into the next slide, which I'll show the table. Actually, let's back up that one slide, make sure I get to that last bullet. Okay, yeah, so that's fine. So let's go to the next slide. So basically, just teeing myself up to say that we use this, this table, which represents sort of a, I guess you can call it a demand curve for ancillary service scarcity pricing. So I want to spend a little time helping everyone interpret what this table means. So you'll find this table both in our BPM and in the tariff itself. And I'll just note that in the tariff, there's actually a different version of this table with different values. This is the table that reflects when the energy bid cap is $1,000. There's a separate table in the tariff for when the energy bid cap is $2,000. So I just wanted to make that clear. But let's start with the, on the very left of this table, you see the various reserve products listed. And so we'll only focus on the upward reserve products for this slide. So that would be non-spinning reserve, spinning reserve, and regulation up. And what you can see, if you start somewhere in the middle of the page where it says shortage, and it should say less than 70 megawatts. So if there's a if the market does not receive enough offers of ancillary services to meet the non-spinning reserve requirement in an amount that's less than 70 megawatts, the market will establish a penalty price at 50% of the bid cap, or in this case, $500. And so that would be an administrative penalty price that's considered, that the market considers when it's relaxing the non-spin requirement. And then as you move up within the column, the larger the shortage for non-spinning reserve gets, the higher the penalty price for relaxing the procurement goes. And then once you get into spin, the reason why bringing up the cascading ancillary service is important, because this, for the spinning reserve row, that $100 price actually gets added on to the $700 of the non-spin requirement if you have so few ancillary service offers that you can't meet your spin or your non-spin requirement. You would have a penalty price in sum of $800. And then finally, if you don't have enough offers to meet spin, non-spin, or a portion of your reg up requirement, the market's penalty price would be $1,000, which is 700 plus 100 plus 200. So sums up the value of those penalty prices. Next slide, please. It's also important for ancillary service scarcity pricing just foundationally to understand that ancillary service scarcity may or may not affect energy prices. So when in cases that they do, that is contained within the first sub-bullet, where what happens is you have actually a lack of combined energy and ancillary service offers that are sufficient to meet the combined energy plus ancillary service demand. So what that necessarily means is that in order to get an additional unit of ancillary service, you must take away a unit of energy from another resource. And because of that, opportunity costs get built into the price. Okay, so so just to repeat, when you have a lack of a combination of energy and ancillary service offers to meet the combined energy and ancillary service demand, opportunity costs can be incorporated. Opportunity costs from the AS shortage can be incorporated into the energy price. But that's not always necessarily true. You can have instances where you have plenty of offers for energy, but have a lack of AS offers to meet AS demand by itself. And so in those cases, you don't necessarily have an opportunity cost that gets incorporated into the energy price. And therefore, you can see AS spikes in AS prices that don't affect the energy price. So I see Mark Smith's hands up, and I've gone through a couple slides. Maybe it's good that if Mark has a clarifying question, I not get too far ahead. So let's go ahead and take Mark's question.
Hey, James, this might foreshadow some of your next slides, but it appears that the ISO is going to consider changing both FRP and ancillary services demand curves in some way, either increasing the price specifically, I guess, or considering that, which I think is good and an important step. Our comments were that you should have a price signal before you're actually in a scarcity situation. In other words, you should see prices moving before you have a deficiency in ancillary services, but it's predicted and expected. Is the ISO still open to moving out into that kind of time frame, or is it a preference to stick with actual shortages only affecting price? Thanks, James.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. That's a great question. It does foreshadow a little bit, but I can get into it now. That we tend to agree that the price signal, it is valuable for the price signal to reflect not just prices during an actual shortage event, which both are, I'll call them spiky. So sends prices like we saw in that screen or the slide a couple slides ago, where prices are jumping up really quickly or falling really quickly, to a method where scarcity pricing can sort of come on more gradually. And we think that part of that solution, well, there are multiple ways to achieve this, but we think that one solution that we could achieve, or what we could do to achieve this fairly quickly, is by looking at flexible ramping products specifically. Because if you were able to, flexible ramping product and energy are fungible to the extent where there's always an opportunity cost between them, such that if you are short or going short on flexible ramping product, that's going to be incorporated into the energy price. But we think that because for two things. One, that we don't have deliverable FRP that establishes binding prices, that we're implementing soon to try to sort of fix the FRP prices. that price signal doesn't get reflected in energy price often enough. So that's one piece. But the second piece is that essentially by considering the demand curve values itself, where today we will procure, or we will forego all flexible ramping product procurement at $247 cost. And maybe it's better to reconsider a higher cost for flexible ramping product so that you can have at higher energy values, you know, the FRP and energy cost, or the FRP opportunity cost reflected in the energy price for sort of a longer period of scarcity. And that's even before you would relax your procurement of AS. And so we think that could probably, in the short run, get us what you're talking about, a more gradual price ramp up as we're going scarce, even before the AS shortages actually happen.
Okay.
I don't know if
Thanks.
you have any response to that. Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Okay, let's move to the next slide. Okay, so we foreshadowed a little bit flexible ramping product and how its scarcity pricing works, but essentially the real-time market procures flexible ramping product both in the upward direction and in the downward direction using a demand curve that establishes the price of not fulfilling the requirement. So whenever the price to the market to procure an additional unit of FRP is higher than the associated price on the demand curve, the market will not procure the FRP and will procure an additional unit of energy instead. So the way that the ISO calculates the demand curve for FRP is based on the probability of violating the power balance constraint if the market did not procure the additional flex ramp product. So I said back a few slides ago that oftentimes the power balance constraint for energy is violated not due to sufficient energy offers within a specific interval, but actually violates in an intertemporal way where you don't have enough ramp capability sufficient to move from one interval to the next interval, and that causes a power balance constraint violation, which the FRP product, that's part of what the FRP product is designed to do, is to reduce those spiky prices that can happen by lowering the probability of these power balance constraint violations. So as I mentioned, the demand curve works in a sort of a linear fashion, but then is administratively capped to a $247 value, such that, like I mentioned, the market would procure all additional FRP at a $247 incremental cost to the market. And the reason why it's $247 is because that's directly below the pricing run penalty prices for the AS products. And so to have it at 247 keeps the same priority order that's established. And so kind of getting back to our last conversation, you know, if you were to increase the flexible ramp up demand curve price, you should also consider increasing the ancillary service prices so to maintain that priority order. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so the next couple of slides are going to get at a summary of what the ISO views as the major issues with our current scarcity pricing. And there are two major themes that we'll hit on, each of which have a series of solutions that, you know, we are interested in stakeholders' feedback on how we could achieve a solution to some of these issues. The first is that the current energy bid caps in the day-ahead and real-time markets may not provide the appropriate incentives for market participants during tight system conditions, and in fact, may not provide appropriate incentives for many different market participants during tight system conditions. So to start with, under most circumstances, the day-ahead and real-time offer caps and price caps. So offer caps being the maximum amount a resource can bid for energy, and price caps being referring to the administrative penalty prices, are typically the same. It can be the case that under FERC Order 831 implementation that those triggers can be met in the real-time market, in which case you would have possibility for real-time price caps and offer caps to be higher than they were in the day-ahead market. But it's sort of irrelevant based on the risks in the following bullet. So the real issue here is that market participants of various types face little risk, especially downside price risk, when prices are near the cap in the day-ahead market. So you're in tight system condition, you're expecting day-ahead prices to clear near the cap. Because the two bid cap prices are so close together, it provides all sorts of potentially harmful incentives during tight system conditions. So let's start down the list. First, for load, when you expect prices to clear near the bid cap, there's very little downside financial risk for load to underschedule. Because what can happen is, if for example, prices cleared in the day-ahead market at $950, and then the most that they can be in the real-time market is $1,000, you have to weigh the risk of if I underschedule a load and I have to pay for incremental energy at $1,000, there might be an equal chance that I only have to pay the $100 that we showed in a couple slides ago. And so in these conditions, there may be an incentive for load to underschedule, which is obviously an issue in tight system conditions and was referred to in the summer 2020 report as a significant issue that contributed to the load shedding events of that year. The second thing is that there's real low financial risk for unavailable supply. So suppliers have to buy back their schedules if they're not available in the real-time market. And if the price, if the prices can only move up so, a subtle amount compared to the amount that prices can fall, then, that's not a huge incentive to be available. The third thing for storage, there may be little financial risk for storage to deviate from its day-ahead schedule, again, to thinking about how the opportunity for prices to fall in the real-time market relative to the potential for them to rise in the day-ahead market or in the real-time market. And then lastly, incentives for convergence bidding. Convergence bidders are poor in these conditions because, convergence bidders are, their purpose is to arbitrage the markets and to converge prices. But when the day-ahead market prices are so near the bid cap that there's little downside risk to a virtual supply position, say a day-ahead price that clears at $950, and very little upside for a virtual demand to participate at $950. It's the potential for convergence bidders to do what they're intended to do and converge prices. The calculus there does not match what is needed under those system conditions. And so we provide a little bit more information about that in the paper. Let's move to the next slide. So that was sort of the theme of issue number one. This is issue number two as we see it. That ancillary service scarcity pricing is not fully effective in setting scarcity prices. So I'll call it the long-term view here is that, as I mentioned, the CAISO does not re-optimize ancillary services in real time. And because it does not re-optimize ancillary services in real time, you don't always get scarcity pricing effects that would happen if you were co-optimizing together. And in addition, only does not procure incremental reserves in RTD. And so in Dr. Harvey's slide, when we saw that RTD prices during the load shedding event tanked, several minutes earlier before the FMM prices, perhaps that one of the reasons why is due to this issue. So it is on our policy roadmap to consider deliverable ancillary services as more of a longer run issue. Deliverable ancillary services basically means that you would evaluate ancillary services that, if they were converted to energy, would not violate transmission constraints. So we do have that as part of our policy roadmap to consider in the next few years. But it's a really large implementation change. And under this initiative, we should be thinking about shorter to medium term changes that may help in anticipation of those longer term changes. So, as we foreshadowed with my conversation with Mark, we can consider in the shorter term to increase the penalty prices of ancillary service and flexible ramping product, which, as I had described, would allow the ISO to set prices or would allow the scarcity of these prices to occur more gradually as the ISO approaches scarcity conditions. So, for example, if we had, this sub-bullet here just describes the way that relaxing flexible ramping product in the upward direction at $100, when you have the last economic energy bid at $200, then the energy price would be set to $300, which is another way to describe how the opportunity cost of flexible ramping product gets consumed within the energy price, and then you have achieved a better scarcity pricing signal. And another thing we're going to need to look at if we consider the penalty prices of AF and FRP together is how they align with the imbalance reserve penalty prices. So, that will be something that we will consider specifically within day-ahead market enhancements where the imbalance reserve product is being considered itself, but we would need to think about those two things more holistically. This may have been my last scarcity pricing slide. Okay, so I will stop and pause if there are any questions in the chat or anybody wants to raise their hand. And it can be questions, clarifications, offering suggestions. If anybody has any comments, feel free.
This time I don't see any hands raised.
Okay. Of course, we'll build in some time. There may be some time at the end if questions come up. We can always come back. Okay, let's switch topics then. Okay, so this set of slides will talk about fast start pricing and relate to the content of our issue paper. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, so let's take a big step back and just think about what, why exactly is the ISO looking at fast start pricing? So we're reassessing our initial position on fast start pricing as we pursue a regional day-ahead market with a different generation fleet, potentially different operational needs for a regional market. And so we're opening this question up in this initiative on fast start pricing to, ask ourselves the question, is it possible that fast start pricing could more accurately reflect system costs in a regional context? And so we're open to that possibility. But we should also note that, our initial concerns, some of our initial concerns, especially the way that fast start pricing interacts with the flexible ramping product, we still have those concerns. And so when we're thinking about fast start pricing policy, it's going to need to be a holistic look at the real-time market's performance and to weigh the incentives together, to get a good solution. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so a very basic diagram to describe what we're talking about with fast start pricing. So I will slowly go through this simple diagram here. So first, this chart reflects energy bids in the vertical axis and the quantity of bid quantity in the horizontal axis. So what this is showing is an example of a resource that only has one bid segment, this green line here. And what this chart is intended to show is that this particular resource has one small bid segment, but they also have a PMIN, or PMIN is a term to describe the minimum operating level of a resource. Their PMIN is far away from zero. So they have a range from 0 to PMIN that the resource is not dispatchable or operational. And so what this intends to show is that when we're talking about fast start pricing, in the classical marginal price-based markets like the California ISO has, this type of resource would not be able to set price if this resource were needed incrementally at some range between 0 and their PMIN. But they can set the price if they're incrementally needed in the range between PMIN and wherever this bid segment ends. So if the demand sort of intersects this green line here, they can set the price. But if not, the resource cannot set the price. So let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so this slide talks about the FERC NOPR on fast start pricing. So back in 2016, FERC had issued a notice of proposed rulemaking that was intended to recognize that fast start resources are the marginal resource used to meet the next increment of energy or operating reserves demand, and that the ISO should incorporate methods to recognize these resources can be the marginal unit and enable them to set price. So practically speaking, the two common features of fast start pricing that are observed within every implementation of fast start pricing are as follows. Number one is that you have minimum output relaxation in the pricing run. So can we go back to the previous slide? So essentially what that means is that the pricing run of the market will consider a resource like this, for example, to be dispatchable between the ranges of 0 and its PMIN, where ordinarily that resource could not set the price between those levels. Fast start pricing enables this resource to set the price by thinking about its operational constraints differently, where this resource can be dispatched anywhere between, between 0 and its PMIN. So let's go forward, next slide. Okay, and then the second feature is that and different ISOs have different methods of doing this, but in some way, we're including the commitment cost in the marginal price. Okay, so it's not just considering the the marginal energy bid of this resource, but also is considering the resource various commitment costs, which in the California ISO market would be startup costs and minimum load costs. Next slide. So just a recap of the California ISO's response to the FERC NOPR back in 2016 and 2017. The summary of it is that the California ISO felt that fast start pricing would undermine its efforts to incentivize and compensate flexible resources in real time. And another way of saying that is that there were some let's say negative effects on the way that prices were working as the ISO was implementing its flexible ramping product into the real-time market. And so the issue was that, if you have fast start pricing enabled, the market can potentially dispatch units in a way, or may not dispatch units in a way that secures the ramp that's needed to meet either the net load or the net load uncertainty in a future interval. So the net load uncertainty refers to part of the flexible ramping product that you're not just meeting the expected load from one interval to another, but you're also on top of that needing to procure flexible ramping product to meet the uncertainty within a range of that load in the next interval. So as a result of this issue, the market would not be able to price the opportunity cost of ramp and would not be able to compensate, therefore not be able to compensate suppliers for their provision of this ramp. And it's also possible that the market may not be able to set up the dispatch of resources in a particular way that recognizes the need for future ramp. When fast start pricing is enabled, you have you're enabling a different operational range of these resources that may not jive well with how the real-time market, anticipates future needs. So we're not going to go through any numerical examples to demonstrate this concern on this call, but if you are interested, this link in the presentation, which is also provided in the paper itself, will take you to a set of supplemental comments that the ISO and the ISO's Department of Market Monitoring submitted to the FERC in response to this NOPR, and you can find presentations and other descriptions with some actual numerical examples to walk through to help illustrate this more clearly. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so holistically speaking, every ISO RTO has different needs. There are different, their fleets have different characteristics. Their operational needs may be different. And also, every ISO and RTO is unique in the way that its real-time market optimization algorithms work. And so, while the California ISO is unique in its lack of fast start pricing relative to the other ISO and RTOs that are in the U.S., the California ISO is also unique in its real-time market optimization algorithm, in which it is the only real-time market that uses both multi-interval economic dispatch and a flexible ramping product or flexible ramping constraint in its real-time market. So that is to say that, yes, although the ISO may seem like the California ISO may seem like an outlier on this issue, it is important to, on a holistic basis, to say that the effect of fast start pricing on price formation is going to be different in every ISO because similar system conditions, actually the exact same system condition, can be fed through the real-time market optimization of every ISO and RTO, and they would produce different prices and different schedules depending on the way their algorithm works. And so fast start pricing needs to be considered holistically from that perspective, and we would consider, to what extent fast start pricing could make incremental improvements to our real-time market. But I've also provided this list of 5 other major distinguishing characteristics that other ISO and RTOs, as they've implemented fast start pricing, have had to consider. And each ISO and RTO does it, and may do it in slightly different ways because they're all unique and they all have unique needs. So, for example, the definition of a fast start resource varies between ISO to ISO, you know, how, you know, strict or not strict you make that definition can vary. How each ISO incorporates commitment costs into price, there are various methods to do that. Related to, but not specific necessarily to fast start pricing, is whether and how offline resources are considered within price. Different ISOs have different methods. Whether fast start pricing logic is included both in the day ahead and real-time markets or just the real-time market. And I'll note that ISO New England at the moment is the only ISO or RTO that has fast start pricing only in its real-time market, but it is, that decision was more out of implementation convenience, and it's my understanding that they are working towards getting it in its day-ahead market as well. And then also, you know, it's known that there's potential for, under fast start pricing, for resources to not have incentives to follow their dispatch. And so different ISOs and RTOs have different methods to either generate opportunity cost payments to incentivize resources to follow their dispatch, or may even go the opposite way and have financial penalties to incentivize generators not to deviate. So all of these ways are unique to each ISO, and you know, the California ISO will have to consider its uniqueness in determining what's appropriate for these various categories. Next slide. So this is the last slide of the section, and I just wanted to note that although the ISO did not make any changes to its market in response to the FERC NOPR, the ISO does have some functionality that looks like fast start pricing in its market. And this was actually implemented as part of MRTU. And that functionality is known as the constrained output generator model. So a constrained output generator in our market is defined as a resource with either a zero operating range or has an operating range, a very limited operating range between its PMIN and PMAX. And the issue paper in a footnote describes exactly what the criteria is to be a constrained output generator. But the California ISO market does have the ability to, the functionality to treat constrained output generators as fully dispatchable from zero to their PMAX, as was described as part of the fast start pricing logic, both in the day ahead and real-time market. And this enables constrained output generators to set the price. And constrained output generators don't have energy bids as a typical resource would have. Their energy bids are calculated by dividing their minimum load costs by their PMAX megawatt quantity. So that's another way of demonstrating that, you know, part of fast start pricing is implementing how fast start resources can set or can incorporate commitment costs into price. And so this is a method that the ISO uses for COGS, or constrained output generators. I'll just note that, and I thought a chat question came up that's stealing my thunder, but I'll just note that there are currently no constrained output generators established in the ISO market. We are looking into data to, you know, that will prepare for the straw proposal to describe the quantity of resources that are eligible to be a constrained output generator based on the current definition. But the current rules state that unless you have zero operating range, meaning your PMIN and PMAX are exactly the same, you can elect whether or not to be a constrained output generator. And so historically what's happened is presumably there's, you know, probably a small subset of resources that are able to be, or eligible to be constrained output generators, but none have elected to do so. Okay, so that is the end of fast start pricing conversation. So I'll open it up for questions or comments from the audience.
It looks like we have one caller with their hand raised. And Christian, your line is unmuted.
Hi, this is Christian Lambert with the Public Advocates Office of the California Public Utilities Commission. I have a question and a comment. The question is on page 21, when the CAISO says that the motivation for the CAISO looking anew at fast start pricing is something to do with regionalization. Can you help us understand what that is exactly, why it would be the case that these commitment costs would be considered marginal costs under an extended day-ahead market, unlike they are today, where it's a commitment cost and not a marginal cost, which is a cost that's recovered through bid cost recovery. And then the comment I have here is, when the ISO is thinking through how to put this in a straw proposal, we would really urge you to think through how to avoid potential windfall here, which would come in the form from CAISO load-serving entities, at least those that are subject to Public Utilities Commission jurisdiction, having turned to an increasing proportion of long-term contracts for resource adequacy, and that's partly due to a requirement for the renewables standard portfolio, and it's also due to Commission decisions in the integrated resource planning. The pricing on the RA attribute embedded in those contracts does have an interplay with the forward expectations of negotiators on those contracts for their market revenues. And so if those contracts had been negotiated under this alternative proposal, where these commitment costs would have been in energy revenues, that would have had implications for different pricing on those RA contracts, but there wouldn't be any mechanism for LLCs to go and renegotiate the terms of the long-term contracts that they do have right now. And so if the if the CAISO were to move forward with something like we're seeing here, there's potential that we're basically just adding a layer of cost onto CAISO ratepayers, and that is potentially a windfall shift in value from load to generators. So that's my comment, just something for the ISO that we'd like to see in your straw proposal here. And then again, the question is, what exactly differentiates the regionalization use case for why the CAISO wants to revisit fast start pricing? Thanks.
Christian. Yeah. So first, to address the question related to, can we go back to slide 21? Yeah. So the question essentially was, what about regionalization urges the ISO to relook at fast start pricing? And I think the major thing is that, when the ISO had considered fast start pricing back in 2016, 2017, you're doing so, as I had mentioned, under a certain set of assumptions about your operational needs, a certain set of assumptions about what your generation fleet is like. For example, how many fast start resources do you have within, your operating area? To what we're saying here is that because of regionalization, there may be an opening up our markets to a broader set of stakeholders with different generation fleets and different operational needs. That it may be the case that implementing fast start pricing or some level of it would be beneficial to meeting those needs on a more regional level than was considered when just considering the California ISO. So, that sort of is what it is, that we're open to that being the case and are going to give it an honest look at, whether we can make improvements. Now, on the second point, which kind of I'll connect it to the first point a little bit, which is that, ultimately our goal, as a market operator is not high prices or low prices or prices of any specific level. We're trying to achieve accurate pricing. And under scarcity pricing, we don't want this perception to be, oh, we just want to have high prices during scarce system conditions. No, we want to have accurate prices that reflect system needs at the right times. And the same kind of goes for fast start pricing. It's not, our objective is not to look at price levels up or down in determining whether or not it is just and reasonable to consider fast start pricing. It's really to assess accuracy and whether or not implementing fast start pricing enables us to capture marginal system costs in a better way than we do today. And so, but that said, we also, we understand that there are interplays between the energy market and capacity market, as you described, where, you know, I sympathize with your comment that there may be considerations made in capacity contracts that reflect, you know, future energy prices that did not anticipate fast start pricing. And so, you know, we'll certainly have to consider that as we move forward. I don't know if I have any other specific comment on that, but we're aware there's a dynamic there, and it'll be something that will be part of sort of our holistic approach to fast start pricing. I hope that helps.
Thanks. And if I could just really quickly offer a narrow follow-up question then. So does the CAISO have any reason to believe that uplift payments, whether it's bid cost recovery or some new, you know, something similar for regionalization, that would not, you know, solve the same need without getting into some of these thornier issues? And then responding to what you said on my comment, I would also just point out, you know, I think that's a question about what is a marginal cost and what is not. That's how we get at what is the appropriate price level. And, you know, that same DMM set of materials that you had cited to later in the slides, you know, I think there's a pretty persuasive case that they really dug into the history of why these costs are not marginal costs. But again, the follow-up there is, you know, does the CAISO not think that bid cost recovery or some other kind of uplift payment system would solve these possible issues? And it sounds like they may not actually be coming from the ISO. If I heard you right, you said you were open to it being the case. So maybe if that's coming from other stakeholders, I don't know if you can speak to them, but from the CAISO's own perspective, couldn't this just be dealt with uplift payments as we have today, even if there's some sort of change that needs to be made?
Yeah, and you're asking, actually both of those questions are, they're great questions, and I'd say they sort of verge on sort of more philosophical. And, you know, in my, you know, as we've been preparing for this initiative, it is clear to me that there is not a consensus on what is the best way to capture marginal system costs. And it is a great question. And I think that when we're thinking about marginal costs, one perception could be that for a fast start resource who is not able to set the price conventionally through like a marginal price-based pricing scheme, where you can sort of expand your definition of marginal from being, you know, the unit that serves the next infinitesimally small unit of demand, to maybe opening up your definition to, as the FERC had put in its NOPR, which I think might be on the next slide. Can we go to slide 22? 23?
Hey, James, this is Brad Cooper. I just wanted to clarify a couple of things. So, you know, fast start pricing is not about cost recovery, it's about price formation. We already have in our market bid cost recovery that makes resources whole to the extent payment at our LMPs don't cover its commitment costs. You know, fast start pricing is about getting that into the LMP for price formation. You know, if the marginal resource is a fast start resource, I think it would actually be indifferent whether it got that payment through an energy payment at a higher LMP, or I got a lower energy LMP plus a make-whole payment. It would come to the same thing. I think actually the difference is for the inframarginal resources. And then as far as whether fast start pricing is the actual marginal cost, you know, DMM has made arguments one way, FERC looks at it another way, and you know, and I'm not trying to be a fast start pricing advocate. I'm actually neutral on the issue. I'm just stating the situation. You know, FERC has approved fast start pricing in every other ISO's tariff. So obviously they consider in the situation of a fast start resource that the commitment cost is part of the marginal cost. And I realize that's still a theoretical debate, but you know, that's not where FERC has landed, is what's just and reasonable.
Thank you very much. I guess we just encourage the ISO to look to what is in the Public Utilities Code about reducing to the extent possible the economic cost to the state's consumers. And you know, there are a lot of ways, depending on how that straw proposal goes, that this could actually increase costs pretty significantly for the state's ratepayers, which would be okay. From our perspective, there's a lot of fixing what isn't broken around this question.
Oh, sorry for interrupting. You were cutting out. I thought you were over. Yeah, I just wanted to add on there. You know, I don't think it's, you know, one thing we got to keep in mind is we can't look at increases in LMPs due to fast start pricing as that's going to be the net cost to consumers, because you know, at least theoretically, what a resource needs for its capacity contract is its going forward fixed costs, or its going forward costs, you know, minus its I guess it's going forward fixed costs minus its energy market revenues. So to the extent the energy market revenues increase, that should be reflected in a capacity contract decrease. So in that sense, it would be no net cost. And you know, as far as existing RA contracts, you know, we're struggling with the same issue in the day-ahead market enhancements with the balance reserve payments and allowing RA resources to bid, you know, for balance reserves. And you know, we have the same, you know, concerns with existing contracts. But you know, I'd note I've been through a number of ISO market changes, you know, over 20 years, and every time we do one, we hear about existing contracts, and every time we end up finding a way around the existing contract issue, you know, because our market has to continue to evolve, and you know, we can't be hamstrung perpetually by existing contracts. So we recognize that's an issue, but it's an issue we got to work through.
Thanks, Brad. And just closing with, again, a lot of those contracts are now going to be minimum 10 years if they're coming out of the integrated resource planning process or from the statutory requirement behind renewables portfolio standard procurement. So that's probably a difference from prior years, and that's going to mean that if there is a windfall on this question of what goes into the capacity payments and what gets in energy revenues, it's going to be locked in those contracts for 10 years. So we do urge you to be careful with that. Thank you very much.
All right, moving on to our next hand raised. Jeff, you are unmuted.
Hi, James. It's Jeff Spires with PowerX. I just wanted to express appreciation for the CAISO's willingness to reconsider its previous position on this. I recognize that implementing fast start pricing would need to be done properly and with consideration of the CAISO's existing market design elements as you were describing. But just like I was presenting at the last meeting, our analysis that we did suggests that this is really a significant price formation issue, in particular during the net load peak hours when gas peakers run on a regular basis and the prices aren't reflective of those resources without having pricing logic that incorporates them appropriately. And, I really agree with much of what you and Brad have been saying. Number one, that the objective with respect to price formation and with respect to fast start pricing is not to have prices that are high or low. It's really trying to find accurate prices, and reflecting gas peakers is one of those important topics to allow for the market price to more accurately and more transparently reflect the marginal cost of meeting load in the hours when those resources are being used. And, one of the important, or there's, obviously multiple facets to why accurate prices are necessary, but, one of them being providing uniform compensation to all resources that are able to make themselves available during those periods, reducing side payments that are made to some resources and not others. But, I think ultimately also sending the right price signal to attract the supply that can displace those resources. And that includes, clean resources like hydro, but also like new technologies, storage, batteries, et cetera. Having an accurate price signal that can encourage those resources to make themselves available when they're needed and provide an opportunity to displace gas peakers. All of those are objectives associated with having an accurate price. So I appreciate that CAISO's expressed a willingness to look at this and posted our analysis. And we look forward to continuing to explore the details going forward.
Thanks, Jeff.
All right, moving on to our next hand raised. Michelle, your line is unmuted.
Thank you. Hey, this is Michelle Keto from the CPUC. A couple of questions. So the first is, we have asked for some information on the cost to California consumers of the imbalance reserve product. And I asked whether you guys have done that analysis, because I'm also curious whether you have done any analysis of the impacts of the fast start pricing separate from the PowerX information that was posted. So sort of two questions there.
Yeah, so in terms of imbalance reserves, we're working both sort of internally brainstorming how we could better communicate and extrapolate costs. Also looking at we're working with a third party who's looking specifically at benefits to the EDAM in particular to having imbalance reserves enabled. So I don't have anything more concrete to say about that at this time, but it's something that we're working on. And then for fast start pricing, it's kind of the same.
Yeah, just ask the timeline on that.
I would say that well, our goal is to have those things complete, obviously, before, or sort of in good timing with the next proposal, and potentially even if time allows to have, workshop specifically on something like that. But I don't really have a good sense at this time.
Okay, and then with regard to fast start pricing?
Yeah, so fast start pricing is sort of a similar thing that we are thinking about internally, whether to go forward with an analysis like you described to try to calculate costs of different types of fast start pricing. I guess I'll call them sensitivities, where maybe different definitions of fast start resource or different definitions of how to incorporate costs would affect market costs essentially. And it's something that we're thinking about doing.
And can you tell me the timing on that?
It would happen concurrently with this initiative, and depending on how intense the effort is, maybe by the time the next draw proposal comes out. But obviously it would be something that we would want to have available if we were going to undertake that early enough in the process so that we could, all the stakeholders could use that information to, form their opinions on the proposal.
Okay. I mean, it seems like it's actually pretty important for sort of understanding the overall costs and benefits of moving forward with EDAM. So I would note that CAISO has said that the net benefits are maybe $400 million for the entire EDAM footprint. If 20% of those benefits go to CAISO itself, that's about $80 million of benefits. And then if you add on to that the imbalance reserve product, if there's some estimate of the potential increases over time, likewise, if you take into consideration PowerX's proposal on the cost shift as a result of fast start pricing, which I believe was $1.5 billion from California customers to non-CAISO customers, if that's over 5 years, that's $300 million a year. It starts to look like EDAM is not a net benefit to California CAISO customers. And so if we want to look at that, I mean, I know that you could say it's just a transfer, so it doesn't really matter. But for California, in deciding whether it supports this, I think all of those costs and benefits have to be put on the table and considered. So I definitely encourage you to get those out as soon as possible because they're really sort of critical for assessing whether this is in California customers' interests. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. And I don't have any further comment on the numbers, but I do, I sympathize with the comment, and I agree that it is an important question to be considering all of these things sort of holistically.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, and at this time, there are no more hands raised.
Okay. Let's move on to our next topic. Okay, so this section will talk about issues relating to multi-interval optimization, so we'll get into the next slide. Okay, first of all, what is multi-interval optimization? So the multi-interval optimization that the California ISO has in its real-time market enables the market to position resources to handle changes in a future horizon. So this diagram here on the upper part of the screen represents the RTD market, the real-time dispatch, which is our 5-minute market. And it shows how it's attempting to illustrate that in this blue box here, when you're in the binding interval of the RTD market, the decision the market makes about how to dispatch and price resources in the blue box depends also on how it needs to position resources within the blue box to meet all of the preceding orange boxes after it. And so in doing that, is essentially to say that the dispatch and pricing that is done in the binding interval depends on, in part on, how the system needs to move to meet situations in the advisory intervals and the orange boxes. So in the past, stakeholders have noted that multi-interval optimization in the real-time market may be, or can result in uneconomic dispatch for energy storage resources in particular. And that's what we are undertaking a look at in this initiative. So let's go to the next slide. So just some items to consider. So some of these things have already been or have been debated. For good background material, I think that we posted a link to this in the paper. It would be good to review the October 2021 Market Surveillance Committee presentation that the CAISO made to the Market Surveillance Committee for more information about how the multi-interval optimization works and also its interaction with energy storage in particular. But in this initiative, we'll be considering, to the extent that energy storage resources are uniquely harmed by multi-interval optimization, what we might be able to do about that issue. And so in the issue paper, we bring up a couple of different options relating specifically to the multi-interval optimization itself, you know, we included some discussion about potentially removing the multi-interval optimization, but noted that, you know, this was something that, you know, as part of that MSC presentation that I noted, you know, the ISO's stance really is that overall the multi-interval optimization is really important to enable our real-time market to help meet, you know, future conditions and position resources in a way that will do so. And so I don't necessarily think that removing the multi-interval optimization is on the table in this initiative, but it's just to say that, you know, it's something that in response to the issue relating to storage resources, it's something that had been looked at, just to put all these other options into context. So another potential option is somehow enabling the market to remove storage resources from consideration in the multi-interval optimization, at least in the advisory intervals. You know, in doing so, you know, you still have to maintain power balance, and so there have to be methods for doing so that didn't violate power balance. And, you know, there might be something that we could come up with to do that, but essentially, by in concept, if you were able to remove storage resources from consideration in the advisory intervals, then their binding interval dispatch or their dispatch that would be within that blue box from the previous interval would not consider, you know, future advisory conditions. And just before I move on with going further with that, you know, any of these options we're going to have to, you know, we're going to have to look at on a holistic basis to decide, you know, are the, you know, might the solution be causing more problems than it solves? You know, so any of these options may, you know, be beneficial from certain perspectives where, you know, we saw from the Rev Renewables presentation to our June 9th workshop where, you know, uneconomic dispatch in the real-time market may be very costly to storage resource providers. And so obviously that's not a good thing, but to the extent that making changes to the multi-interval optimization to address that problem can, you know, potentially lead into other problems, we're going to have to, you know, look into it in a more holistic basis to see, you know, really what our goal is to make sure that the real-time market positions our system in a way that can reflect future needs when they're needed. Okay, so then going back to the slides on the third bullet, you know, there's been conversations about potentially weighting earlier advisory intervals higher than later advisory intervals. And in concept, what this might do is if for a storage resource, the market anticipates high prices or big price changes of some sort, you know, 60 minutes in front of beyond the hour, you know, but price levels, you know, in the next 10, 15 minutes may not change that much. Maybe the binding, the solution in the binding interval can in some way, you know, weight those earlier intervals higher when determining price and dispatch. And so then the fourth bullet kind of gets into what I already said, that everything is going to need to be carefully considered here in order not to detriment the efficient operation of the grid. So, you know, in the issue paper, we're going to be seeking comment about, you know, other things the ISO might be able to do within its multi-interval optimization to potentially mitigate this issue in a way that may not be detrimental to the performance. So let's sneak to the next slide to see. I'll go ahead and do this slide also, just because it's sort of related. So sort of beyond the multi-interval optimization changes that are considered in the previous slide, you know, another avenue to look at in terms of storage resource compensation is through real-time bid cost recovery. So let's go through the next slide. So in a sense, it's more of sort of changes to settlements rather than changes to the way the market operates itself. But it's possible that changes to real-time bid cost recovery may improve compensation for storage resources that are uneconomically dispatched and address some of the problems that we're seeing. And so some examples that we noted in the paper, maybe real-time bid cost recovery could consider counterfactual dispatch based on energy awarded strictly based on bids and binding interval prices, and award that on sort of an interval by interval basis. We could also consider, today bid cost recovery is considered on a 24-hour period, and any revenues and shortfalls are netted over that 24-hour period. Maybe we could consider shortening in the real-time market the horizon for which, or I guess I'll call the length of the interval that we'll consider bid cost recovery. So maybe instead of a 24-hour period, it can be made a 4-hour period where resources would be made whole between 4 to 8 p.m. Or something like that. And again, we would, in all of these bid cost recovery solutions, we would have to assess whether or not storage resources really are situated differently enough to warrant different bid cost recovery rules for that resource type, or if bid cost recovery rules would need to apply to all resources. And if it was the case where they need to apply to all resources, we would have to consider, what do those bid cost recovery changes provide the right compensation and incentives for all types of resources and not just storage. So let's take this next slide. Okay, and then I think this is the last slide for the storage part. So today, we also noted in the paper that, the previous two slides talk about potentially increasing, I'll call it increasing the BCR protections for storage resources. But this slide, and in the paper we describe, potentially considering, if we go down more of a, if we don't go down a route like a bid cost recovery route and go towards more of a like multi-interval optimization change route, maybe we would consider bid cost recovery separately, where maybe storage resources have sort of too much bid cost recovery protection. So the first bullet notes that today day-ahead and real-time bid cost recovery is considered separately. So the bid costs and revenues that you earn or that a resource earns within the real-time market is different, and the uplifts are different from those considered in the day-ahead market. And so what we noted in the paper, an issue that could happen is that sometimes a resource can be inframarginal in the day-ahead market, which means that it's just a fancy way to say that its bid is less than the marginal price, and so it's receiving market revenues above its cost or profit, essentially. But then in the real-time market can have schedules that include losses from buying back infeasible day-ahead schedules. And so by having, there are reasons why we separate day-ahead and real-time bid cost recovery, but one of the potential consequences of doing so is that if you generate large losses in the real-time market from buying back schedules, day-ahead schedules, you can have a separate uplift to make sure that you're made whole in the real-time market for doing so. And therefore, the real-time bid cost recovery, in a sense, protects the inframarginal revenue or the profits that a resource earns above its cost. And so in thinking about that, as we're looking at scarcity pricing, and I had mentioned in the scarcity pricing slides that, we need to have, we want to consider how prices between markets, between day-ahead and real-time markets, provide incentives for storage resources to follow their dispatch. Potentially, this issue of real-time bid cost recovery is actually prohibiting storage resources from doing that, and in a sense, sort of protecting the revenues they gained in the day-ahead market. And so, we'll have to think about holistically bid cost recovery in a large context, how it interacts with scarcity pricing. We'll have to think about the multi-interval optimization and how, we don't, like I said, we don't want to implement something where may solve, a storage-specific issue or an issue of resources being uneconomically dispatched, but then creating other problems and creating more serious problems potentially. So I'll stop there, and I see a question in chat, and I'll open it up to the audience, or a question in queue.
All right, Carrie, your line is unmuted.
Hi, this is Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. I'd like to go back to slide 28 if we can, on the multi-interval optimization. This is characterizing the issue a little bit differently than WPTF has articulated in the past. The issue that we see isn't explicitly with the multi-interval optimization, but with the advisory prices differing so significantly from the ultimate binding prices, in part, perhaps in large part, due to load biasing in FASP in particular. And so I was really surprised not to see that specific issue articulated here in the paper. And I'm wondering kind of what happened to that load biasing piece that was initially covered in the first pricing report that kind of spawned this initiative.
Yeah, that's fair, and I'll ask Gabe to add on to what I say. But yeah, you're right that ultimately the issue, and it's sort of as Rev Renewables presentation had alluded to, that ultimately the issue is that you can have advisory price. The market is seeing advisory prices that are, let's say, at a certain level that encourages or the market calculates that the storage resource should be at a certain dispatch level in order to meet those eventually advisory prices that don't, and if they don't materialize, then the storage resource is at a loss. And you're talking about reasons why outside of just normal system conditions you might have, through operator actions or other things, maybe causing discrepancies in those advisory prices from what the actual system conditions might be. So that's a great point. Maybe Gabe, do you have anything to add on to that?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a whole lot more to say about that, why we chose to include, certain language or not at this time. I think, Carrie, if you've got, if you want to put in your comments that, we need to be looking at ways to help make advisory prices more similar to binding prices and potentially look at, I know in other initiatives we've looked at, things like load biasing, and I know we're making efforts to try to help some of those concerns. But if there's other scope that you want us to consider in this initiative, I think we're open to that at this point.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, it was my understanding that when we brought this up in other initiatives, they pointed to this initiative and said, okay, we're going to address the price formation issues and the biasing within this initiative. But I'll go back and certainly will include it in our comments. Thank you.
Yeah, we should probably circle up on that too and just see where everything got left.
Thanks both.
Thank you.
All right, and at this time, I don't see any hands raised.
Okay, we'll go to the last topic. A couple more slides. There we go. Okay, so in this set of slides, we're going to talk about BAA level market power mitigation. So Gabe and I are going to split responsibility for these slides, so I'm going to pass it to him midway through, but I'll sort of tee up this issue and then allow Gabe to sort of walk us through the series of figures that we made for the paper. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so just as a recap, in the EDAM SHROP proposal, the ISO proposed to extend the BAA level mitigation framework that exists already in the Western EIM to the EDAM as sort of a starting point. And then it was decided that that issue in particular would be taken up outside of EDAM and into this price formation initiative. So just as a reminder of where this comes from. So, you know, the WEIM has local market power mitigation measures and it has BAA level mitigation itself. And so we're talking here about the BAA level mitigation aspect. And essentially through this issue paper, we're looking for feedback on whether or not the ISO should revise this market power mitigation methodology, the BAA level methodology, to group together all resources across multiple EDAM BAs that contribute to congestion relief as opposed to testing individual BAs one by one. So the potential benefit of testing BAAs as groups as opposed to individually is that it's possible that by considering BAAs in groups that you can have you can meet the demand within that group competitively, where if you're testing, you know, let's say that you have two groups that you're testing, or two entities that you're testing as a group, and as a group, those two BAs are able to meet the demand in its BAA in the group competitively, but maybe one or the other of those BAs individually cannot meet demand in its own BAA competitively. Then by considering this grouping methodology, we may sort of lower the instances of mitigation by considering BAs in a group. And so part of the reason why it left the scope of EDAM and into this price formation scope is that we think it's probably necessary that if EDAM incorporates this grouping methodology for BAA level mitigation, that we should probably do the same in the EIM or Western EIM also. And so that's sort of why we're considering it sort of on a larger picture than just within the EDAM context. Let's go to the next slide. So just a little bit of summary about what BAA level market power mitigation is. So there are similar principles applied here as there are in locational market power mitigation measures, where we have a DCPA, or a dynamic competitive path assessment, that is testing to see whether or not in the local market power mitigation context, it's looking at whether or not transmission constraints can be are competitive or non-competitive. But in the BAA level context, it's looking at whether or not demand served in a certain BAA can be served competitively or non-competitively. It also applies a 3 pivotal supplier test in the methodology, where, you know, that's sort of the cutoff that's used to determine whether or not there's sufficient supply in excess of the need, you know, to, you know, if there's sufficient supply to consider a sort of competitive condition, the ISO uses the 3 pivotal supplier test as that condition. And it tests the DCPA and the 3 pivotal supplier test against the power balance in each EIM BAA. And so this test is triggered, or mitigation is triggered, or sorry, the test itself is triggered when the power balance constraint shadow price of an EIM, Western EIM area is higher than the CAISO's power balance constraint shadow price due to import congestion. And as part of that mitigation framework, the ISO itself is considered to be competitive. And so, like I mentioned, the RSI, which refers to kind of back to the 3 pivotal supplier test, that may pass for BAAs as a group, but may fail for a BAA specific member of that group when it's considered only in isolation. And so, as I mentioned, it's potential that this grouping methodology may allow both for more accurate mitigation and to have instances where we may be over mitigating by looking at individual BAs by themselves. So I'm going to pass it to Gabe, who had put together some diagrams to sort of explain. Now, and again, this is an issue paper, so it's not necessarily a proposal here, but we did need to provide some detail about what the grouping methodology might look like. And so on the next 2 slides, Gabe can walk us through using the diagrams for illustration, what we would be considering as a sort of this grouping methodology. So I'll pass it to you, Gabe, and we can move to the next slide.
Yeah, thanks, James. I think, just to start, you did a really phenomenal job outlining what the thought process was here. And I think, this is just an illustration of what we're talking about. So we're not, we're not trying to invent anything new here. We're not trying to make anything overly complex. I think the point of these next 2 pictures is just to try to do a very high level, easy illustration of what this grouping paradigm would look like. Essentially, in this first slide, I think we're on slide 36 here. We basically have a very straightforward diagram with 4 different balancing areas. Balancing area 1, 2, 3, and 4. There are some transmission capabilities between the different areas. For example, between balancing area 1, it's actually connected with all 3 of the other balancing areas. Balancing area 2 only has transmission to balancing area 1 and balancing area 4. And then balancing area 4 has transmission with balancing area 2 and balancing area 1, but not balancing area 3. So here in this situation, it turns out that the transmission between balancing area 2 is congested going to balancing area 1 and balancing area 4, but there is no transmission congestion between the other 3 balancing areas. So essentially what you've got is the system prices with transmission congestion being set at $30 in balancing area 2, and then the underlying prices in balancing areas 1, 3, and 4 are $100. Now, in this scenario, the way that we implement market power mitigation in WEIM today is that we would perform a market power mitigation test independently on each of the 3 balancing areas that are shown here in this dashed bubble. So each of the 3 balancing areas with the $100 prices. So we would independently do a test for balancing area 1. We do a test for balancing area 3. We do a test for balancing area 4. And if any one of those tests came back and said, no, you don't have sufficient competition here via the 3 pivotal supplier test, then we would mitigate all the resources in that one particular area. What the ISO is proposing here is actually to group all 3 of these areas together. So to group BAA1, BAA3, and BAA4 together, because there's additional supply within those 3 areas. If the idea would be that if you pass the test there, and obviously there is transmission availability between the 3 areas, then you're competitive in all 3 areas and you wouldn't do 3 individual tests. So let's go on to the next slide, which is slightly more complicated. And I think, this is the part of the proposal that gives some people some heartburn. But essentially now, instead of just having 4 balancing authority areas, we've got 5 balancing authority areas. We've kind of got that same layout between BAAs 1, 3, and 4. But now there's transmission between BAA1 and BAA2 and BAA4 and BAA5. So what's happening here, again, there's congestion from BAA3 to balancing area 1 and balancing area 4. So they're kind of grouped off by themselves, and they see higher prices than balancing area 3. In this particular case, balancing area 3 has a price of $30. Balancing areas 1 and 4 have a price of $100. But there's transmission between the two areas, and that transmission is not at full capacity, not fully used. So the prices are the same in both of those balancing areas. But there's also congestion from balancing area 1 to balancing area 2. So you've got higher prices in balancing area 2, and then you've also got congestion from balancing area 4 to balancing area 5. So with this grouping proposal, what we're suggesting here is that we see the congestion between balancing area 1 and 2 and areas 4 and 5 and balancing area 3 and sort of the rest of these areas. So instead of again, performing 4 independent tests for each of the balancing areas just with the capacity from those balancing areas, we'd only perform at most 3 tests. The first test would be, the first and second test would be for areas balancing area 2 and for balancing area 5 independently, because they're independent and they only have supply within their own balancing areas. And then we would do a third test if both of those first 2 tests failed for balancing areas 1, 2, 4, and 5. And again, we're talking about all the supply in those 4 areas. And if that supply was deemed competitive, then group 3 would be deemed competitive, and balancing area 1 and balancing area 4 would not have market power mitigation applied, whereas they may have had market power mitigation applied if they were tested individually. Additionally, just to simplify things, we would say that if we looked at the availability of generation in balancing area 2 or the availability of generation in balancing area 5, and either of those 2 areas was deemed competitive, we wouldn't necessarily need to do competitive analysis for group 3, and we would automatically deem that competitive as well, and we wouldn't be applying market power mitigation for any of the resources outside of the groups that didn't fail the test. So I think that's basically all I had there, James. Maybe we should open it up for questions on this section.
Yeah.
All right, looks like we have a hand raised from Carrie. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, this is Carrie Bentley from the Western Power Trading Forum. I just wanted to confirm that one of the changes here would not be to apply system market power to the CAISO, that it would still be considered competitive. Or if not, maybe you can explain the difference between what you were thinking for the original system market power proposal and this proposal.
We've spent a little bit of time, we've obviously gotten the question, hey, is this system market power? I wouldn't call this system market power mitigation. I would almost call this, like a common sense approach that you would want to take to verify system market power in a EDAM scenario. You wouldn't want to do 4 individual tests here. You'd want to do 2 or potentially 3 individual tests to determine whether or not these areas are competitive. We're not specifying anything specific here to the CAISO area, and that was one of the aspects of the system market power proposal. So maybe that helps. I don't know, James or Brad, maybe you've got something else to add.
Yeah, Carrie. When we use that term system market power mitigation, I think what we really were talking about was CAISO BAA level market power mitigation. That's just what we meant by system. So this proposal would do BAA level market power mitigation to the ISO. And the other big change is today in the EDAM market power mitigation is triggered based on the the power balance shadow constraint of an EI and BAA, I'll call it their SMEC. Technically, it's not their SMEC, I don't think, but the other term's too long to say. If currently today that there's this competitive LMP calculated, like as the price at the midway bus in the ISO or something like that. If other market power mitigation is triggered at the BAA level, if it's higher than the system, than the Cal ISO competitive LMP. So today there's no triggering of a market power mitigation test at the Cal ISO BAA level. What this proposal does is it takes all the BAAs and or groups of BAAs, depending if they have the same SMECs, and sorts them in order and starts going from the highest price down to the lowest price, and then finds out whether it's competitive or not, and then mitigates, and then the BAAs further down the list aren't tested because they're tested as a group and they're competitive. So to the extent the ISO is up in one of those higher price tiers, it might be by itself. So to the extent it's by itself, it would be tested for competitiveness at the ISO BAA level. To the extent the ISO is grouped, like for example, with Nevada and Arizona in a group, and they're the highest price SMEC, we would test all three BAAs together. So hopefully that answers your question.
It does, yeah. So in a nutshell, yes, system market power will be in the future applied to the CAISO under this proposal. I understand the groupings, but I just think that's important to say very clearly.
BAA level.
Yeah, BAA level, yeah, okay. Including the CAISO. All right, yep, thanks for the clarification.
And the way it differs from our previous, what we were calling system market power mitigation, is we weren't doing that grouping, and if you remember, there was a lot of quote unquote funky things we were doing to determine whether the ISO was really import constrained or not, and then there was considerations of like, okay, who do we consider import constrained with us, and and all that. This a lot more elegantly does all that.
Elegantly, but I would argue perhaps not logically, but we will definitely put that in our comment spread. Thanks.
All right, looks like we do not have any more callers with their hands raised.
So
thanks, Gabe.
I think you might be next up. Yeah. Go ahead, James.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks for helping us walk through those diagrams. Okay, let's move to the next slide. Okay, so, this is Brenda. Now, before, I just want to say that part of this issue paper, we are soliciting for if there are additional scope items that stakeholders think should be included within price formation enhancements. Stakeholders are welcome to include those in their comments. And I'll also just add that as part of the comment template, as part of the comments, we are interested to hear stakeholders' perspectives on, proposals that, they think will help the ISO achieve or solve some of these issues that were presented today. And so your feedback will matter greatly in terms of us, as we move forward towards a straw proposal, considering the things that were recommended that we look at will help us, move forward towards actual concrete proposals. So, yeah, thanks you all for your feedback today, and I'll pass it over to Brenda to talk next steps.
Thank you, James. So for today, we are going to be developing those comment templates, hopefully available tomorrow for all of you. feel free to visit the stakeholder website when we do publish those. And then that deadline is July 26th. So please be cautious of that strict deadline. We try to keep that deadline very flexible for everyone, but if something does come up, please let us know. But July 26th is our deadline for this issue paper comments, for written comments. And then let's go to the very last slide just to give a quick update on the Stakeholder Symposium that we will be hosting in person this year at the Safe Credit Union at the Convention Center in downtown Sacramento on November 9th and 10th. We so far have so many great registrants at this time, so feel free to continue inviting all your team members to this convention that we'll be hosting in the symposium. The early bird registration rate is still available, so take advantage of that. And then if you do have any questions, direct them to the symposiumreg@CAISO.com. And at this time, we don't have any other questions, but if you do, let us know. But other than that, I'll pass it back to Chris to help conclude this event.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.